speaker, Dr. Louis Akenji, the managing director of the Hot or Cool Institute, who's working with the United Nations agencies, the European Commission. He's done a lot of work with the African and Asian development banks, and he's a technical and also a policy advisor to national governments, including Finland, Sweden, Hungary, Japan, and Indonesia. And a few years ago, in 2057, he was one of the founders of the Universal Basic Services Program, which we all know so well. So over to you, Dr. Louis Akenji, tell us, how did we get here to 2060? Over to you.
Thank you so very much. Thank you. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. I just want to say it was really a privilege experiencing the music, because it wasn't just listening, it was experiencing it. And for those of you born before 2040, you will remember the terrible times when music was composed by AI and sung by automated machines. Thank God we got back to our senses and and went back to some decency, some roots, talked to our ancestors. So I couldn't get a newspaper for this week, but I got the one for last week. So it's a Friday, 25th. But the news tells of the times that we are in. So for those of you who have been here for a week, if you want to go by Amsterdam, make sure you go to the Cultural Center to see the latest exhibition it has on the crazy 20s and 30s, some of the nasty times we went through. There's a lot of stuff in there.
Your jacket's doing a wild time too, so I'm just gonna, yes,
All
perfect,
right.
There we go.
Do I look 2060s? Yes, I do. All right, so, and you know, it's also a bit of a crazy time because now we have cyber pirates on strike. They're attacking the EU to drop its demands that AI cannot be used by non-state actors. So it's a bit of a wild time we're going through also. But also countries like Costa Rica that have always been at the forefront of what sustainability should be, focusing more on the well-being of their citizens, and now showing how bottom-up governance could really look like. There's a lot more this year. Holland being very generous and having learned from the experience of protecting its country against sea level rise, is now offered autonomous region to the Eastern Island people whose island has gone under the sea. So things are getting crazy. And you just heard the news of the 21-year-old AI genius who was appointed on the governing council of Estonia. But it's not all very positive, is it? Remember the crazy 2030s and the 40s when people were experimenting with geoengineering? Now we're seeing some of the consequences right now, and we're not quite sure what direction to take. But how did we get here? How did we get here so fast? And why do things look so radically different? You would remember a time when we talked about biodiversity laws, the climate crisis, something called COVID-19. Pandemics didn't just start this decade. They've been going on for quite a while now, although they've gotten worse and worse. And we just couldn't get our acts together. There was just so much going on that we realized we needed to move away from it. And at a time when the Hot or Cool Institute was really still young and in Berlin, it did this analysis showing lots of things going on. First of all, where we needed to be by 2030, that was 3 decades ago, and where we needed to be 1 decade ago. And just because it was so overwhelming, we learned lots of lessons. These are footprints of citizens in G20 countries about 4 decades ago. What it showed very clearly is the magnitude of reductions that was needed. By the way, this excludes military spending, which was huge at the time. Thank God we also came to our senses, and a little bit of that is down. But already what you see in some of this was the tension that existed globally. Countries like India, Indonesia, Brazil, where lots of the resources are, and where they have populations, hundreds of millions of people that they still needed to get out of poverty, we're busy working, supplying for the appetite of people in these other countries on the other end of the chart. So this social tension on a global scale was manifesting, but also within countries, it became very clear that it was the top 10% that was causing a lot of the problem and shifting the burden to the bottom 50% that were only emitting about 10% of the CO2 emissions that we're complaining about. So the youth got furious. That's my grandma, by the way. The youth got really furious and said, nah, we're not going to take this anymore, right? And we remember through history, there's always been a lot of bloodshed. It's either we change something or the things climate changes. So, of course, we learned lots of lessons. For one, the urgency and the scale of the challenge we were facing did not allow us time to handhold people individually to a sustainable future. But a lot of the solutions that we were attempting were at national level, national government policies, environmental issues at a national level. But the consequences transcended national borders. This artificially created lines that we've developed for ourselves. And political views were also evolving at a global scale. And we quickly learned, for those of us that worked at the research institutes at the time, that it's not all about technology or just putting out numbers and so on. It was really about our ways of living. And it's not only reductions, as we showed in the first slide. We needed to radically change everything. So we started with a few false friends that we had around the time. We had spent so much time talking about eco-labels, which was just another way of supporting economic growth. And then the new Trojan horse came. Remember the automobile industry saying, let's all get to electric vehicles, right? And then carbon offsetting, just shift the trouble over to those guys there that we cannot see. And ESG, the license we granted to companies to lie to us all the time. And you would remember the time when hundreds of thousands of people would gather in cities in something called the COP and just kept reinventing the agenda and lying to people. Thank God, we've gone past that. So where are we now? We now live in urban villages, and there's a lot of rewilding going on in reclaimed spaces that are out there. There's also now a lot, we've shifted from our very individualistic focus, and we have a public luxury now, so lots of public libraries, car-free city centers, public recreational facilities, a lot of things. When you get into your home, you're quite sufficient and you're living really well, as you would very well know, but when you go outdoors, it's very luxurious and lush. It was not always like that. Oh, sorry, I missed one thing. But remember this story of eco-labels, when we used to force the do-gooders, the people that are actually producing well, to convince us that they're sustainable, and they ended up overwhelming everybody. This was complete nonsense. So we thought, if we've been using public health, social security concerns to edit out certain choices from society, why don't we use sustainability as a criteria? So we flipped the script. Instead of proving that you're a good guy, you needed to convince everyone that you have to function. You're providing a value. We had the on-eco label, which we put on products which we thought, you're not bringing any value. You're not contributing to our well-being or the well-being of the environment. We had to edit out those things, right? But now everyone, as you know, you spend some of your carbon allowance coming here this morning. That is, of course, because it's become very clear that each one of us has a budget. It's not what's in your credit card, it's not what's in your wallet anymore. It's your CO2 credit. And if you can fly wherever you want, but if you fly once, you're not going to do it for the next 5 to 10 years. So squander your budget, if you will, and become carbon poor, which means your well-being is also starts going down. So all those consumer loyalty programs, air miles, frequent flyer programs, and so on, they're out now because no one wants to spend your carbon credit on all of that. But we now also have something which you all know because you live in this kind of house. It's called universal basic services. Essentially, we now know that for a few things that are quite fundamental to everyday living, shelter, so that is housing, food, and mobility services, they're not open to profit making anymore. There's no more speculative financial investment in housing. Something so basic that citizens of London, Amsterdam, and so on had to go on strike to say you can't be making money off of where we live, right? Things like healthcare, which used to be quite controversial in a few countries, are now public and universal. And of course, food is, you can still buy food. Of course, we still buy food, but the very basic meals are provisioned free of charge. What does the big picture now look like in terms of governance? So I'm going to go through two different scenarios, one, different things that are happening, one at a global level, and another one at a national level. What we used to know as the United Nations Environment Program, and has now been combined with the UNFCCC, as you must have heard the news. It's now the UN Council on Ecological Stability. It's not only that it's been brought together, it's also been upgraded to be at a level of what the Security Council used to be, and now there's a legal mandate. So all those useless COPs where people used to come together and talk and create lots of paperwork and not follow up is becoming very different, right? The second one is global resources, which was such a major source of tension between China and Europe, or between African countries and Europe. There's always Europe there somewhere. Nah. Historically, Europeans were a bit of something, yeah? So all of that tension is being reconciled instead of allowing global resources to be exploited and controlled at just a national level. There's a global sort of body that has authority over this, that is rationing, and that is also making sure that all the critical materials that we have are going into valuable use rather than just for profit generation. But we also know that a few other political blocs have become very strong. The Association of Southeast Asian Nations and the Sub-Saharan African Union have joined forces, have all become very powerful in their own right, just as we had the European Union back then. And they've just said, no, you're not going to exploit resources so randomly and exploit us so randomly anymore. And so global governance has become a little bit more balanced, and there's a little bit more value in there. Well-being is now driving policy, and not just profiteering, as the song put it. But at a national level, what does it look like in the various countries where you come from? We know that citizens are much more active in terms of participatory governance right now. There's strengthened local communities because, of course, we have digital channels, we have ways of getting people more involved in governance. But the principle of universality is now commonly applied across policy design. Why? Because I showed the example of what is happening in terms of housing, but that is also happening in terms of food. So things like universal basic income, which were discussed back in the days, it's no longer just income anymore. The sense that we all, as human beings, should have a very fair space, a fair playground, and our well-being should be priority rather than the profits of just a few. And for this, there's what is now commonly understood as a fair consumption space for everybody that guides our way of living. This includes not just that people who are over-consuming needed to calm down or need to calm down now, but there's now a social floor below which we don't allow anyone to fall. The thing called poverty has now been recognized as not just financially related, but well-being oriented. And there's a cap on wealth. We know that in no country in the world is the top 10% allowed to own more than 40% of national wealth. In fact, there are some countries discussing that this needs to come down to a maximum of 20%. And our policies are now guided by a well-being direction. We have the Sustainable Well-Being Index and the Social Tension Index, which guide us when each time we get a policy, we ask, is this moving us towards well-being or it's creating more social tension? We want to avoid the revolutions and the bloodshed of the past. And last but not the least, we're rethinking what it means to be a business. Are you actually providing value? Are you generating value to society? Or you're just redirecting resources towards waste and lining the pockets of a few? I think this pretty much sums up a lot of what we now have in the 2060s. Three key principles: living within ecological limits, justice and fairness in terms of access to opportunities for all, and we're guided by well-being, not only of individuals, but collectively as a society. Thank you so much.